The city exhaled its stale, damp breath as dusk bled across the sky, smearing bruised purples and oranges over the skeletal silhouettes of brick tenements. Alara pulled the collar of her worn coat tighter, a useless gesture against a chill that was more than just the autumn air. It was the cold of indifference, of a million closed doors and averted eyes. She walked with a steady, practiced pace, her footsteps a quiet counter-rhythm to the distant wail of a siren. The sound was the city's lonely heartbeat. But tonight, another sound had attached itself to hers. A scuff of a boot on pavement. A low, guttural laugh that snagged in the air. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just the usual ghosts of a neighborhood that had long ago given up. But the sound persisted, a shadow that clung to her heels, growing heavier with each step. She didn't turn. Turning was a sign of fear, and fear was an invitation. Her father had taught her that. Stand your ground, even when your knees are shaking. Especially then. But the concrete felt like it was turning to mud beneath her feet. There were 3 of them. She could feel their presence, a predatory weight in the air behind her. They weren't trying to be subtle. This was a game to them, a sport. The street was lined with windows, squares of pale yellow light where families were eating dinner, watching television, living lives she could only imagine. A woman watering a pot of dying geraniums on her fire escape saw Alara's quickened pace and the men swaggering behind her. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The woman's expression didn't change, but she turned with deliberate slowness and disappeared back inside. The metal clang of her screen door a final, definitive sound of refusal. Another door down the block clicked shut. A set of blinds rattled closed. Each small act of disappearance was a brick being laid in the wall of her isolation. She was being erased from the world, right here in plain sight. Humiliation washed over her, hot and sharp, more potent than the fear. They weren't just following her. They were proving that no one cared enough to stop them. The alley appeared on her left, a jagged mouth of darkness between a laundromat and a boarded-up butcher shop. Before she could pass it, a figure detached from the group behind her and stepped into her path. He was tall and wiry, with a cruel smile that didn't reach his flat, empty eyes. "In a hurry?" he sneered, his voice like gravel scraping on rust. His 2 companions fanned out, blocking any escape back the way she came. They were a pack, moving with the fluid, thoughtless cruelty of animals. The leader, the one who had spoken, took another step closer. His name was Silas, though she didn't know it then. To her, he was just the embodiment of the city's rot. "We just want to talk," he said, the lie hanging thick and greasy in the air. He gestured toward the alley. "Let's go somewhere private." The demand was not a question. It was a statement of ownership. Over her, over the street, over the silence of the cowards hiding behind their curtains. The city had judged her, found her unworthy of notice, and had delivered her to its wolves. She was trapped, the damp brick walls of the alley seeming to sweat with a cold, greasy dread. This was the moment where her world shrank to the size of a cage. Silas pushed her, not hard, but with an arrogant finality, sending her stumbling back into the narrow chasm of the alley. The stench of stale garbage and urine filled her nostrils, a physical manifestation of her own degradation. His 2 cronies, hulking figures who seemed to be made of little more than cheap leather and menace, sealed the entrance. Their silhouettes against the fading streetlights were like tombstones marking the death of hope. Silas sauntered after her, his boots crunching on broken glass. He circled her slowly, a predator enjoying the final moments before the kill. "See," he said, his voice echoing slightly between the brick walls. "Nobody's coming. Nobody ever comes." He ran a grimy finger along the line of her jaw, and she flinched, a tremor of revulsion running through her. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You're nothing. Just another shadow in a city full of them. You think anyone in those apartments even remembers your face? They're just happy it's not them down here." His words were designed to strip her of her humanity, to reduce her to a thing, an object for his amusement. He wanted to see her break, to see her plead. That was his true currency. The fear in his victim's eyes was more valuable to him than whatever he might steal from their pockets. He leaned in close, his breath a foul mix of stale cigarettes and cheap liquor. "You're going to scream," he whispered, his voice a venomous promise. "And the only thing that will hear you is the rats." The other two laughed on cue, a practiced and hollow sound. They were a well-oiled machine of intimidation, their every move calculated to crush the spirit. The pressure in the alley was immense, a physical force pressing in on her, threatening to suffocate her. The distant city sounds faded into a dull roar, and the world became this small, filthy stage for her humiliation. He saw the tremor in her hands, the slight widening of her eyes, and his smile broadened. He was winning. He was proving his dominance. He was asserting his belief that the weak existed only to serve the strong, that dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford. He saw her as a reflection of the city itself, broken, anonymous, and his for the taking. Alara's mind, however, was not breaking. It was sharpening. In the suffocating grip of fear, a different part of her began to stir, a core of stillness forged in a crucible of past sorrows. She wasn't a fighter, not in the physical sense. Her strength was of a different, more durable kind. She thought of her father, a man whose quiet presence had been a mountain in her life. He had been a soldier, a sergeant in a unit whose name he rarely spoke, but whose code he lived by every day. He'd come home from his tours not broken, but tempered like steel. His hands, though scarred, had always been gentle. He had taught her how to pack a wound, how to read a map, and, most importantly, how to control the one thing an enemy could never truly take, her own mind. "Fear is a signal, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "Tells you to pay attention. It doesn't tell you to run." After he was gone, lost not to a war but to the quiet, creeping battle of a sickness that stole him piece by piece, she had been left with his lessons. She had nursed him through his final months, facing down the twin horrors of pain and loss, and had learned to stand firm in the face of the inevitable. She had learned that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to be defined by it. She carried his memory in a small, silver locket around her neck, its surface worn smooth by the constant touch of her thumb. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of him in his dress uniform, his eyes clear and steady. That locket was her anchor in a world that often felt like a storm. It was a reminder that she was the daughter of Sergeant Miles Corbin, and a Corbin did not break. The pressure in the alley mounted. Silas grew impatient with her silence, his twisted amusement souring into irritation. He snapped his fingers, and one of his thugs stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with a sound like pistol shots in the enclosed space. "Maybe she's deaf," the thug grunted, his face a mask of brutish stupidity. "Maybe we gotta get her attention." He reached for her, his thick, sausage-like fingers aiming for her arm. The sounds from the street had completely vanished. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting. Through the narrow gap at the end of the alley, she could see the legs of people walking by on the main sidewalk, their pace unhurried. They were so close, yet a world away. A delivery truck rumbled past, its engine a temporary reprieve from the suffocating quiet. No one looked. No one saw. The windows above remained dark, the curtains drawn tight. The community had made its choice. Silence. Non-involvement. It was the bystander's creed, an unspoken pact of self-preservation that left the vulnerable to fend for themselves. Alara felt a profound sense of desolation, a loneliness so complete it was almost a physical pain. She was utterly, terrifyingly on her own. Silas watched her face, searching for the crack, the first tear, the first whimper. He thrived on that moment, the final surrender. He raised a hand, stopping his man. "No," he said, his voice soft again, dangerously so. "Let her think about it. Let her understand just how alone she is." He wanted to savor it, to draw out her agony. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken violence, each second stretching into an eternity of dread. This was the moment, the precipice. Her survival instincts screamed at her to collapse, to beg, to do whatever they wanted in the faint hope of mercy. But her father's voice echoed louder. Dignity is the last line of defense, Ellie. They can take everything else, but not that. Never that. Something inside her shifted. The frantic, terrified beating of her heart slowed, settling into a hard, steady rhythm. She wasn't going to give him what he wanted. She would not be a source of amusement. She would not be another broken thing left in an alley. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. Her eyes, which had been darting around for an escape, now fixed on Silas's. They were not defiant or challenging, but calm, unwaveringly calm. It was a gaze that did not acknowledge his power, a gaze that simply saw him for what he was, a petty, cruel man who fed on the fear of others. She straightened her posture, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was an act of profound rebellion. Her hand went to the silver locket at her throat, her fingers closing around the familiar, cool metal. It was a subconscious gesture, a soldier touching their standard before a charge. "My fear is my own," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the foul air with the clarity of a bell. "You can't have it." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. She was sacrificing her instinct for self-preservation on the altar of her own dignity. She was choosing to be brave, even if it was the last choice she ever made. The shift was instantaneous. Silas, who had been expecting tears, was momentarily stunned by her response. Her quiet refusal was more disorienting than any scream could have been. At the far end of the alley, obscured by the deep shadows spilling from the rear entrance of a dive bar called the Crow's Nest, a man flicked a cigarette into a puddle. Its ember hissed and died. He was large, built like a blacksmith's anvil, with a thick gray beard and arms covered in faded ink. He and two of his brothers had been watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of men long accustomed to the city's casual cruelties. They had seen it 100 times before, but they had never seen this. They saw her chin lift. They saw the absolute stillness in her eyes. They heard her words, faint but clear. The man, whose road name was Forge, grunted. "Look at that," he murmured to the biker next to him. "Kid's got sand." The other man, a leaner, younger biker called Razor, nodded slowly. "She ain't breaking." They were members of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club, a brotherhood bound by codes stricter than law. They policed their own, and they valued strength above all else. But their definition of strength wasn't about brute force. It was about honor. It was about standing your ground. What they were witnessing was not a victim about to be brutalized. It was a soldier holding the line. Forge took a long, slow drag from a fresh cigarette. His eyes narrowed, studying Alara. He saw the way her hand rested on the locket, a gesture of reverence. Something about it stirred a memory, distant and hard. The whispers began among the small group of bikers. Their initial indifference had evaporated, replaced by a grudging, growing respect. Forge made a decision. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply crushed his cigarette under the heel of his heavy leather boot and gave a short, sharp nod to Razor. Razor pulled out his phone, his thumb moving quickly over the screen, sending a single, coded text message. There was no immediate response, no sudden action. For another minute, the tense tableau in the alley held. Silas, recovering from his surprise, sneered. "Brave words," he spat, his anger returning. "Let's see how brave you are when." He never finished the sentence. It started as a low, deep vibration, a thrumming you felt in your teeth before you heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong in the narrow, claustrophobic streets of this forgotten neighborhood. The rumble grew, multiplying, layering on top of itself until it became a physical force, a deafening, ground-shaking roar that vibrated through the concrete and rattled the windows of the silent apartments. From both ends of the street, headlights appeared. Two at first, then a dozen, then more, a swarm of single piercing eyes cutting through the twilight. An army of motorcycles descended on the block, their engines a synchronized chorus of thunder. They formed a perfect, impenetrable blockade at both ends of the alley, their chrome and steel glinting under the streetlights. The vultures were trapped. The engines cut out in unison, plunging the street into a sudden, shocking silence that was heavier and more threatening than the noise had been. Doors opened along the block. Faces appeared in windows drawn out by the sheer, overwhelming spectacle. A wall of men, all clad in the same leather cut bearing the emblem of a stoic, helmeted knight, the sigil of the Iron Sentinels, dismounted from their bikes. They moved with a quiet, disciplined purpose, their presence radiating an aura of absolute, unassailable authority. Forge walked from the shadows of the crow's nest and into the alley, the other bikers parting for him like water. He was not the biggest man there, but his presence was immense. He ignored Silas and his stunned cronies completely, his gaze fixed on Alara. He stopped a few feet from her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something that was not pity, but recognition. "You stand your ground, little sister," he said, his voice a low gravel that commanded attention. His eyes dropped to the locket still clutched in her hand. "That insignia," he said, his voice softer now. "I know it. Let me see." Alara, trembling now not from fear but from the sheer, surreal turn of events, hesitantly opened her hand. Forge leaned in, his gaze intense. The locket was small and tarnished with age, but on its surface was a finely engraved crest, a striking eagle over a chevron, a symbol of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. Forge's breath caught in his throat. He had that same crest tattooed on his own chest, hidden beneath layers of leather and road dust. "My father," Alara whispered, finding her voice. "Sergeant Miles Corbin." The name hung in the air for a moment. A wave of understanding washed over Forge's face, followed by a deep, profound sorrow and an even deeper respect. He looked from the locket to her face, and now he could see it. The same steady eyes, the same unbreakable set of her jaw. "Miles." Forge breathed the name like a prayer. He turned to his men, his voice thick with emotion but carrying to every corner of the street. "This is Sergeant Corbin's daughter." A murmur went through the ranks of the Sentinels. Miles Corbin was a legend within the circles of veterans in the club, a man who had died pulling 3 of his men, one of them a much younger, much wilder Forge, out of a firefight they had no business surviving. He had been their shield. His sacrifice had bought them their lives. And this young woman, his daughter, standing in a filthy alley, facing down scum like Silas, was carrying his legacy of courage without even knowing the full story. The truth was now revealed, not just of her identity, but of the source of her incredible quiet strength. It was an inheritance. It was honor passed down. The Sentinels turned as one, their collective gaze falling on Silas and his 2 thugs, who now seemed to shrink, their earlier bravado dissolving into pathetic, animal fear. The atmosphere shifted from tense to glacial. This was no longer a street crime. It was a desecration. They had threatened the daughter of a hero. They had insulted the memory of a fallen brother. Forge looked at Silas, his eyes as cold and hard as granite. "You put your hands on the daughter of a better man than you will ever be," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You made a mistake. What followed was not a fight. It was a reckoning. It was swift, brutal, and executed with the chilling efficiency of a military operation." The Sentinels moved in, a wave of black leather and righteous fury. There were no wild swings, no chaotic brawling. Every movement was precise, economical, and devastating. One of Silas's men was lifted off his feet and thrown into a dumpster with a sickening crunch. The other was disarmed of a hidden knife and subdued with a series of crippling joint locks that left him whimpering on the greasy pavement. Silas himself was left for Forge. The gang leader, who had built his reputation on preying on the helpless, now found himself utterly and completely helpless. He tried to run, but 2 bikers blocked his path, unmoving as stone statues. Forge walked toward him, and for the first time Silas pleaded. "Please," he whimpered. Forge didn't even blink. He grabbed Silas by the front of his jacket, his grip like iron, and slammed him against the brick wall. "She showed you dignity," Forge growled, his face inches from Silas's. "I'm going to show you what happens when you disrespect it." He didn't kill him. He shattered his pride, the source of all his cruelty. leaving him a broken, humiliated mess on the ground. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, Forge turned back to Alara. In a gesture of profound significance, he unzipped his own leather cut. His colors, the symbol of his identity, his history, his brotherhood, and gently draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of leather, road dust, and engine oil. It enveloped her like a shield. "You're under Sentinel protection now," Forge declared, his voice booming down the silent street. A proclamation meant for every open window and every fearful neighbor. "This is our street now. And she is one of ours." The community, which had been watching from the safety of their homes, saw it all. They saw the swift, decisive justice. They saw the incredible act of respect. And in the collective silence, a profound sense of shame mingled with a newfound awe. The aftermath was not an explosion of violence, but a quiet, powerful reordering of the world. The Sentinels didn't just roar off into the night. A dozen of them remained, their bikes parked in a neat, formidable line along the curb. 2 of them, silent and imposing, escorted Alara the final block to her small apartment building. They didn't speak, but their presence was a comfort more profound than any words. They waited at the bottom of the stairs until they heard the click of her deadbolt. She stood in her small living room, the heavy leather vest still draped over her shoulders, its weight a tangible promise. She looked out her window and saw them down below, standing watch. The city no longer felt cold and indifferent, felt watched, protected. The next morning, the crude, spray-painted tags of the vultures that had marred the brick walls of her neighborhood were gone. In their place, on the wall of the alley where she had been cornered, was a single expertly stenciled image, the helmeted knight of the Iron Sentinels. It was a warning and a seal, a claim of territory rooted not in fear, but in honor. When she walked to the corner bodega for coffee, the owner, Mr. Chan, a man who had never so much as met her eye before, rushed out from behind the counter. "On the house," he said, pressing a hot cup into her hands, his gaze filled with a new and unfamiliar respect. The woman who had been watering her plants on the fire escape was there again. This time, when their eyes met, she didn't retreat. She offered a small, hesitant smile and a nod. The entire neighborhood seemed to breathe differently. The air of fear and apathy had been replaced by something else, something tentative but real. A sense of shared responsibility, sparked by the quiet courage of one young woman and the thunderous loyalty of the brotherhood that had answered her unspoken call. The final, lingering image of her transformation was this: Alara, standing on her small balcony, sipping her coffee, the morning sun warming her face. Down on the street below, 2 sentinels sat astride their silent Harleys, their vigil unbroken. The distant rumble of another bike approaching was no longer a sound of menace. It was the sound of family. It was the sound of belonging. Her father had taught her to stand her ground. In doing so, she had not only saved herself. She had found an army, and she had reminded a forgotten corner of the world that even in the deepest shadows, dignity could shine a light that others would follow. The roar of their engines was a promise, a testament to the fact that respect, once earned, was the strongest shield of all.